when a decorated veteran began barricading his quaint suburban home behind a towering, bizarre cage of scrap wood, the neighborhood scoffed. They called him paranoid. They called him crazy. But when the deadliest winter in a century descended, their laughter froze in their throats. Arthur wasn't losing his mind. He was preparing. Arthur Caldwell was not a man who spoke just to fill the silence. A retired Army Corps of Engineers veteran who had spent his youth building bridges in frozen, unforgiving territories, he preferred the quiet company of his aging German Shepherd Duke. For a decade, Arthur had lived peacefully in a small single-story ranch house on Elm Street in the affluent manicured suburb of Crestwood, Ohio. The neighborhood was a pristine collection of perfectly edged lawns, smart homes, and young professionals who viewed Arthur as a harmless, slightly eccentric relic. That perception changed violently on a crisp morning in late September. It started with the delivery trucks. Not just one, but 4 massive flatbed semi-trailers rumbled down the quiet tree-lined street, their air brakes hissing loudly enough to wake the entire block. They parked haphazardly on Arthur's front lawn, crushing his modest flower beds. To the horror of the neighbors sipping their morning coffee, the trucks unceremoniously dumped over 30 cords of split oak and hickory firewood directly onto Arthur's property. It was a staggering, almost comical amount of wood, a mountain of timber that completely eclipsed his small driveway and threatened to spill into the street. Tom Jenkins, a 30-something software developer who lived next door, stepped out onto his porch in his silk bathrobe, his jaw slack. "Hey, Arthur," Tom called out, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Planning a bonfire big enough to see from space? Or are you just trying to drive down my property value?" Arthur didn't reply. He simply stood at the edge of the woodpile, a battered leather tool belt slung over his shoulder, his weathered face completely impassive. Beside him, Duke let out a low, protective huff. Arthur patted the dog's head, turned his back to Tom, and picked up a framing hammer. That was day 1 of the construction. Over the next 3 weeks, the neighborhood watched in mounting bewilderment and eventual outrage as Arthur began to build. He wasn't just stacking the wood. He was constructing a continuous, wraparound lean-to shed that hugged the entire perimeter of his house. Using heavy-duty treated lumber and corrugated tin, he built a slanted roof extending 5 feet outward from his exterior walls, anchoring it deeply into the soil. It completely obscured his windows and swallowed his porch. Once the framing was up, Arthur began the grueling task of stacking the 30 cords of wood beneath the tin roof, creating a solid 4-foot-thick wall of timber that fully encased his home. Brenda Gable, the self-appointed president of the local neighborhood watch, was absolutely scandalized. She spent her afternoons taking photos of Arthur's property from behind her living room curtains, uploading them to the community Facebook group with frantic captions. "The man has lost his mind," she wrote. "It looks like a shantytown fortress. He's turning Elm Street into a war zone. I've called the city. This cannot be legal." But it was. When David Higgins, the frustrated city zoning inspector, finally arrived with a clipboard full of complaints, Arthur calmly met him at the end of his driveway. Arthur produced a meticulously drawn set of blueprints, citing a nearly forgotten local ordinance that allowed for temporary winter fuel storage structures without a permit, provided they did not encroach on public sidewalks. Because the shed was technically unattached to the main load-bearing walls of the house, and because it was strictly for firewood, Arthur was operating entirely within a legal grey area. David Higgins left defeated, much to the fury of Tom and Brenda. The neighborhood's outrage soon morphed into cruel amusement. Teenagers walking home from school would stop to point and laugh at the crazy veteran's wooden moat. Rumors swirled that Arthur was suffering from severe paranoia, that he believed a foreign invasion was imminent, or that his time in the military had finally caught up with his sanity. Arthur ignored it all. The physical toll on his 68-year-old body was immense. He worked from dawn until dusk, his hands blistered his back, aching, methodically interlocking each piece of firewood like a master mason laying bricks. He engineered the stacks so tightly that scarcely a sliver of daylight could pass through them. Duke was always by his side, occasionally picking up smaller kindling sticks in his mouth and dropping them at Arthur's boots, a silent partner in the exhausting endeavor. Tom Jenkins took to hosting weekend barbecues on his pristine back patio, specifically inviting friends over to drink craft beer and mock the bizarre construction site next door. "I'm telling you, the guy thinks the apocalypse is coming." Tom laughed loudly over the fence one Saturday, ensuring Arthur could hear him. "He's building a bunker out of kindling. One stray spark and that whole contraption is going to go up like a Roman candle." Through the mockery, the whispers, and the blatant disrespect, Arthur remained entirely silent. He didn't build his fortress out of madness, nor out of spite. He built it because he had spent 40 years studying structural thermodynamics, weather patterns, and survival. He had been tracking the atmospheric pressure anomalies over the Arctic, cross-referencing them with historical data from the National Weather Service. He knew something that the arrogant, comfortable residents of Crestwood did not. He knew that the coming winter was not going to be normal. It was going to be a monster, and his bizarre shed was the only thing that was going to keep him, and perhaps the very neighbors who were laughing at him, alive. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, Arthur's massive project was complete. His quaint suburban home had been entirely swallowed by a wooden carapace. From the street, the house looked like an absurd windowless timber bunker, with a gleaming tin roof slanted precisely to shed heavy weight. The only visible entry point was a narrow, reinforced wooden tunnel leading to his front door. Inside the wraparound shed, the 30 cords of firewood were stacked with architectural precision, creating an impenetrable 5-foot-thick layer of solid oak and hickory that shielded every square inch of his exterior walls. The ridicule in Crestwood had reached its peak. The local newspaper even ran a small tongue-in-cheek article in the lifestyle section, titled "The Woodchuck of Elm Street," featuring a wide-angle photo of Arthur's barricaded home. People drove from neighboring towns just to slow down and gawk. Tom Jenkins went out of his way to purchase a massive, incredibly loud electric snowblower, leaving it on his driveway, just to loudly boast about how modern technology was all a man needed to beat the cold. December rolled in with a biting, deceptive calmness. The skies were a brilliant clear blue, but the temperature hovered stubbornly around 20 degrees. The residents of Crestwood, trusting their high-efficiency natural gas furnaces and smart thermostats, paid little attention. They decorated their homes with extravagant holiday light displays, oblivious to the monstrous weather system gathering momentum just north of the Great Lakes. On December 14th, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The local meteorologists who had been predicting a standard winter storm suddenly shifted their tone to one of outright panic. A highly unstable polar vortex had collapsed, plunging southward with unprecedented speed. It began not with snow, but with freezing rain. For 12 hours, water fell from the sky and instantly turned to solid ice upon impact. It coated the trees, the roads, and the power lines in a thick, glittering, heavy glass. Then, as the sun set, the temperature plummeted a horrifying 40 degrees, in a matter of hours dropping to 20 below zero. Finally, the blizzard hit. Hurricane-force winds howled through the suburban streets, driving blinding horizontal sheets of snow before them. At 8:15 p.m., a massive ice-laden oak tree down the street groaned and snapped, crashing violently through the primary power lines. Transformers blew in a cascade of brilliant blue flashes, lighting up the blinding white snow. In an instant, the entire town of Crestwood went entirely black. Inside his home, Tom Jenkins cursed loudly. He fumbled for his smartphone, turning on the flashlight. "Just a downed line," he assured his shivering wife. "The crews will have it back up in a few hours. The house is insulated. We'll be fine." But they were not fine. The storm raged with an intensity no one had prepared for. The winds whipped at 80 miles per hour, finding every microscopic draft in Tom's modern open-concept home. Without electricity, the smart furnace was a useless hunk of metal. Within 4 hours, the temperature inside Tom's house plummeted from a comfortable 70 degrees to 45. By morning, the situation had shifted from uncomfortable to terrifying. 3 feet of snow had fallen, drifting up to 6 feet against doors and windows. The roads were completely impassable. Snowplows were stuck in ditches, and emergency services were entirely paralyzed. The temperature outside was a lethal 30 below zero, with a wind chill that could cause frostbite in minutes. Brenda Gable woke up to the sound of a sharp crack echoing through her walls. Her pipes, frozen solid in the extreme cold, had burst, sending icy water flooding across her hardwood floors before freezing into a treacherous skating rink. She sat on her sofa, wrapped in every blanket she owned, weeping as her breath plumed in white clouds in her own living room. Next door, Tom Jenkins was desperate. The temperature inside his house was now in the low 20s. His wife was lethargic, huddled under a duvet. He decided he had to try and reach his backyard shed to grab some decorative logs for his small aesthetic living room fireplace. He forced his back door open against the snowdrift, stepping out into the blinding white chaos. The wind knocked him to his knees instantly. The cold was a physical assault, a stabbing pain in his lungs. He crawled through the waist-deep snow toward his shed, only to find the door frozen shut under an inch of solid ice. Defeated, freezing, and terrified, he looked over his fence toward Arthur Caldwell's property. What he saw made him freeze entirely. Arthur's house was the only structure on the block that didn't look like a frozen tomb. The slanted tin roof of the wraparound shed had perfectly deflected the heavy snow, dumping it safely away from the house's foundation. But more incredibly, the dense 5-foot-thick wall of firewood, acting as a barrier around the house, was working exactly as Arthur had engineered it. It was a massive, impenetrable layer of thermal mass. From where he knelt in the snow, Tom could see something even more astounding. Through a small gap in the shed's framing, a soft, warm, orange glow emanated. Inside his fortress, Arthur Caldwell was sitting in his favorite armchair, reading a book in his shirt sleeves. The temperature in his house was a balmy 72 degrees. The genius of his design was finally evident. The wood surrounding his house provided extraordinary insulation, trapping the heat from his central wood-burning stove. And the firewood stayed, a concept Arthur had perfected. In previous winters, outdoor wood piles became buried in snow, frozen together, or ruined by moisture, forcing people to risk their lives trudging outside. Arthur didn't have to go outside. He had left his actual house, windows open behind the shed's walls. Whenever his stove ran low, he simply walked to his living room window, reached his arm through, and pulled a perfectly dry, room-temperature log straight from the inner wall of the wood cage. He had built a self-feeding, impenetrable fortress of warmth. Shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard they ached, Tom Jenkins realized the horrifying truth of his arrogance. The man they had mocked, the man they had tried to run out of the neighborhood, was the only one who held the key to surviving this frozen hell. Swallowing the last ounce of his pride, Tom dragged himself through the suffocating drifts, making his way toward the wooden tunnel of Arthur's front door, praying the old veteran was more forgiving than the storm. Tom Jenkins pounded his numb, frost-bitten fists against the heavy oak of Arthur Caldwell's front door. He couldn't feel his fingers. The howling wind threatened to rip his lightweight winter coat straight off his back, and the narrow, reinforced wooden tunnel Arthur had built over the walkway was the only thing keeping Tom from being blown over entirely. Tears of humiliation and physical agony froze on his cheeks. He braced himself, expecting the veteran to laugh, to turn him away, or perhaps to not answer at all. Instead, the door swung inward immediately. A wall of glorious, life-saving heat hit Tom like a physical force. It smelled of dry, roasting hickory and hot coffee. Standing in the entryway was Arthur, dressed in faded Levi's jeans and a thick flannel shirt, looking entirely unbothered by the apocalyptic nightmare raging outside. Beside him, Duke the German shepherd let out a low, inquisitive whine, his tail thumping rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Tom collapsed onto his knees in the foyer, gasping for air, his chest heaving as the warm air hit his freezing lungs. "Arthur!" Tom choked out his voice, cracking, completely stripped of his usual arrogant swagger. "Arthur, please! I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The power is out. Our furnace is dead. Sarah is under the blankets, but she's not shivering anymore. The house is like an icebox. Please, you have to help us." Arthur Caldwell didn't smile. He didn't utter an, "I told you so." He didn't gloat about the weeks of merciless mockery he had endured from Tom's back patio. The veteran simply evaluated the situation with the icy calm of a man who had seen worse. He had survived the brutal winter deployments in the mountains of Afghanistan, and he had studied the catastrophic Texas grid failure of 2021. He knew exactly what the human body did when the core temperature dropped. "Get up, Tom," Arthur said, his voice a low, steady gravel. "Drink this." He handed Tom an old, battered Stanley thermos filled with scalding black coffee. "Duke, stay." Arthur turned to a heavy wooden locker in his hallway and pulled out his extreme weather gear. He donned a heavy-duty Carhartt Arctic insulated coverall, a pair of thick Gore-Tex gloves, and a woolen balaclava. He handed Tom a spare set of heavy wool blankets and a heavy canvas tarp. "We wrap your wife in the blankets, then the tarp to block the wind. We carry her between us. We don't stop moving, understood?" Tom nodded frantically, tears welling in his eyes again. "Yes. Yes, whatever you say." Stepping back out into the blizzard was like walking into a meat locker equipped with a wind tunnel. The 30 below zero wind chill stripped the breath from their lungs. They fought their way through the waist-deep drifts across the property line. Inside Tom's dark, freezing, multi-million-dollar modern home, the silence was terrifying. They found Sarah in the master bedroom, her lips tinged with a dangerous shade of blue, her pulse sluggish. Arthur worked with military efficiency. He bundled Sarah tightly, essentially turning her into a human burrito, insulated by wool and shielded by the canvas tarp. Together, the two men hauled her out into the blinding white chaos. Every step back to Arthur's fortress was an agonizing battle against the drifts. But the moment they crossed the threshold of Arthur's front door, Sarah let out a long, shuddering breath. The 72-degree heat of the living room immediately began to thaw the deadly chill from her bones. Arthur dragged a massive plush armchair right up to the roaring Vermont castings wood stove in the center of the room. "Keep her close to the iron," Arthur instructed, tossing Tom a pair of dry woolen socks. Before Tom could even finish thanking him, Arthur was back at the front window. He peered through the thick glass, looking past the densely stacked wall of firewood outside. The storm was worsening, the snow falling so fast it looked like a solid white sheet. "Arthur?" Tom asked, his voice trembling as he rubbed his wife's hands. "What is it?" "Flashlight," Arthur muttered. He pointed toward the street. 3 houses down, second-floor window. Tom squinted through the gap in the woodpile. It was Brenda Gable's house. The beam of an LED flashlight was flicking on and off in a frantic, unmistakable SOS pattern. Brenda, the woman who had tried to get the city to tear down Arthur's shed, was trapped. Arthur didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy crowbar, 2 high-lumen tactical flashlights, and a coil of heavy nylon climbing rope. "Tie one end of this rope to the doorknob," Arthur commanded Tom. "If I get disoriented out there, I follow it back. Keep feeding the stove. The wood is in the kitchen window." "You're going back out there?" Tom asked, aghast. "For Brenda. After what she did." "Nobody dies on my watch, Tom," Arthur said flatly. The trek to Brenda's house was a nightmare. The street was indistinguishable from the lawns. Abandoned cars were completely buried, forming treacherous hidden mounds. When Arthur finally reached Brenda's porch, he found her front door frozen completely shut by a foot of solid ice, the result of her burst pipes flooding out the threshold and freezing instantly. Arthur swung the heavy steel crowbar, shattering the ice with brutal rhythmic strikes until he could force the door open. Inside the house was a disaster zone. A sheer sheet of ice covered the hardwood floors. Brenda was huddled in her upstairs bathroom, the smallest room in the house, clutching her shivering golden retriever. When she saw the towering silhouette of the veteran in his snowy Carhartt gear, she broke down into hysterical, ugly sobs. "Arthur!" she wailed, burying her face in her hands. "I'm so cold. I'm so sorry. I was so wrong." "Save your breath, Brenda," Arthur said gently, reaching down to haul her to her feet. "We have a bit of a walk. Keep the dog close." By the dawn of the second day, Arthur Caldwell's modest living room had completely transformed. It no longer resembled a quiet bachelor pad. Instead, it had become a fully functional, highly efficient Federal Emergency Management Agency triage center. The apocalyptic storm raging outside showed absolutely no signs of breaking. The Ohio power grid remained entirely crippled, catastrophically overwhelmed by the sheer crushing weight of the ice and the relentless hurricane-force winds. Yet tucked safely away inside Arthur's wooden fortress, 6 people and 3 dogs were resting comfortably in a balmy, life-saving 72 degrees. Arthur had single-handedly managed to rescue Tom and Sarah Jenkins, Brenda Gable, and an elderly couple named the Millers from across the street, carrying them through the blinding whiteouts into his sanctuary. The refugees sat huddled together in a makeshift circle around the glowing iron belly of the Vermont castings wood stove, sipping rich hot chicken soup that Arthur had resourcefully heated on the stove's flat iron top. A profound silence hung over the group, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the muffled, terrifying roar of the blizzard crashing helplessly against the thick wooden barricade outside. They were in absolute awe of the flawless engineering of the fortress they had so viciously mocked just weeks prior. Tom Jenkins, clutching a ceramic mug of broth between his thawing hands, watched intently as Arthur walked into the kitchen. Arthur reached out and casually slid open the window above his sink. Instead of a lethal blast of sub-zero air rushing in, there was only the solid, perfectly stacked wall of split oak. Arthur simply reached his bare arm into the exterior woodpile, pulled out 3 perfectly dry, room-temperature logs, and closed the glass window. The firewood stayed. It wasn't buried under 4 feet of impenetrable ice. It wasn't soaking wet from the horizontal driving blizzard. Because the heavy timber was stored tightly against the house and entirely shielded under the corrugated tin roof, it absorbed the ambient heat bleeding through the exterior walls. This meant the wood was dry, warm, and ready to ignite the second it touched the embers. "It's a giant thermal battery," Tom whispered aloud, his eyes wide as he finally understood the brilliant physics of the design. The wood cage acts as insulation. It stops the wind dead in its tracks, traps the radiant heat from the house, and keeps the fuel perfectly dry. You never even have to step foot outside. "Precisely," Arthur replied, tossing a fresh log into the roaring fire. The flames flared up, casting a warm, golden, flickering glow over the exhausted and pale faces of his neighbors. "I learned the mechanics of it from an old trapper up in Juneau, Alaska, back in the late 80s. Out there in the bush, if your wood gets buried or wet during a deep freeze, you don't just get uncomfortable. You die. I saw the barometric pressure dropping a month ago. I saw the jet stream shifting on the weather maps. I knew the city grid wouldn't hold up to a historic freeze of this magnitude." Brenda Gable, wrapped tightly in Arthur's heavy patchwork military quilt, stared at the floorboards in profound, crushing shame. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at the man she had tormented. "We called you crazy, Arthur. I took photos of your home. I posted awful, cruel things about you online. I called the zoning board to try and force you to tear it down. And yet, you still came out into the ice for me." Arthur sat down heavily in a wooden dining chair, resting his large, calloused hand on Duke's head. "In the service, you don't get to pick and choose who you pull out of the fire, Brenda. You just pull them out. A community is only as strong as its weakest link. I built the shed to keep myself alive, yes, but I bought 30 cords of wood because I figured I might have to keep all of you alive, too." The room fell into a stunned, reverent silence. The veteran hadn't just prepared for his own survival. His extensive preparations were made with the quiet, stoic foresight that his arrogant neighbors would inevitably need his help. The catastrophic blizzard raged on for 4 consecutive days. The affluent city of Crestwood was brought completely to its knees. Pipes burst in hundreds of modern, unprotected homes, causing tens of millions of dollars in catastrophic water damage. Dozens of families suffered severe frostbite, and the local county hospitals were soon overwhelmed with critical hypothermia cases. But on Elm Street, safely secured behind a bizarre, windowless wall of chopped wood, not a single person perished. Not a single finger was lost to the frost. On the morning of the 5th day, the howling, violent winds finally died down to a gentle breeze. The sun broke through the iron-grey clouds, reflecting blindingly off the massive 6-foot snowdrifts that buried the neighborhood. The eerie silence of the frozen suburb was eventually broken by the heavy mechanical roar of diesel engines. A convoy of Ohio National Guard Humvees and heavy municipal plows crawled slowly down Elm Street, breaking the trail. Men in winter camouflage began knocking on doors expecting the absolute worst. When a weary, freezing lieutenant trudged up Arthur's freshly shoveled walkway and entered the wooden entry tunnel, he was completely bewildered by the blast of heat. Arthur pulled the heavy front door open. The lieutenant blinked, feeling the incredible wave of warmth wash over his frozen face. He looked past Arthur and saw half a dozen neighbors sitting comfortably around a glowing stove, playing a relaxed, cheerful game of Monopoly. "Sir," the lieutenant stammered, pulling off his frozen goggles. "We're doing emergency wellness checks. The rest of the block has been evacuated to the high school gymnasium. Are you all okay in here?" "We're doing just fine, Lieutenant." Arthur smiled slightly, gesturing to the kitchen. "The coffee is hot if you and your men want a cup." The incredible story of the Crestwood Fortress spread like wildfire across the county in the weeks that followed. When the power finally returned to the grid and the great spring thaw began, Arthur slowly began to dismantle the outer shed. However, he didn't have to lift a single piece of timber alone. Tom Jenkins, armed with a crowbar and a new sense of profound humility, was there every single morning at dawn to help. Brenda Gable organized a massive neighborhood potluck on Arthur's lawn to help stack the remaining wood neatly along his backyard fence. The mocking laughter was gone forever, completely replaced by a deep, enduring and unspoken respect. Arthur Caldwell was no longer the crazy, paranoid old veteran of Elm Street. He was the undisputed patriarch of the neighborhood, the man whose calloused hands, brilliant engineering, and quiet foresight had built a literal wall of life between his neighbors and the deadliest winter of a century. And as for the firewood that stayed, Arthur never had to buy a single cord of wood again. The entire neighborhood pooled their resources to ensure his racks were completely full every single autumn for the rest of his life. Did Arthur's incredible foresight and unforgiving survival instincts leave you speechless? Sometimes the very people society labels as crazy are the only ones prepared for reality. If you were captivated by this intense story of survival forgiveness and community against the odds, please smash that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder to never judge a book by its cover, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life survival stories.